St. Gregory Palamas, The Triads, Book 1, translated by Robin Amos. Triads in Defense of the Holy Hesychast, the First Triad, Translator's Introduction. St. Gregory Palamas was a monk, a scholar, a bishop, and a figure of some historical importance. He was also a hesychast, a practitioner of the hesychastic inner stillness taught by the early fathers of the Church as a way of opening the mind to God. In those days, the mainstream of Christian spirituality was still centered around the ascetic exercises first recommended by St. Paul. For the hesychasts, many of them living away from people or in monastic communities, these exercises were taken as a complete way of life, a Christian equivalent of the practices of monks and hermits in Eastern faiths. By the 4th century, the Christian use of the word Hezekiah was clearly and precisely defined, as when it was used, quote, to describe the state of inner rest and silence which victory over the passions gained for a monk, and so allowed him to proceed to contemplation, end quote. The term was used by Gregory of Nyssa in his Life of Moses, which, in addition to Gregory Palamas's Triads, gives one of the best definitions of the contemplative mysticism of Nyssa's slightly earlier time. This was one of the stages through which the teachings of the Church was developed further to correct a growing loss of understanding of the original New Testament teaching, a loss which still continues today. It was in these elaborations of the original Christian teaching that differences between the inner and outer churches, the ascetic, and the purely liturgical forms of Christianity first began to become visible. St. Gregory Palamas' Triads played and continue to play an important part in this. As far as I know, this translation of Palamas' Triads is the first complete translation into English undertaking. It is certainly different in emphasis from what I have found. Its source is found in the same text as Nicholas Gindel's translation in Classics of Western Spirituality series, and it has attempted to address a question previously addressed in the earlier version, that of the existence in the same text of detailed spiritual teaching alongside what appeared to Meyendorff, the translator of the book into French and advisor on the previous English translation, to be polemical. Studied in this way, the book itself is then found to reveal unexpected characteristics of the culture which gave it birth. An understanding of these characteristics as they are understood in practice in the same geographical region to this day, on Mount Athos in particular, transforms and clarifies the meaning of the translated text. In its light, much of what has been seen as based on a polemical attitude is revealed as a genuine defense of the methods of spirituality which formed the basic motif of the scientific discipline of the hesychastic culture of the Eastern churches. What remains polemical is shown in a different light by this same fact. It can now be clearly seen as a genuine treatise on knowledge and truth from the viewpoint of that different culture, and we can see that the polemical element serves in a way commonly used by authors of that time as a mask intended to cover some of their deeper teachings in order to avoid causing confusion. In this translation, certain words of the psychological meaning have been left in the original Greek, particularly nous, N-O-U-S, and psyche, which in our times are both found to be translated in many very different ways. Some of these differences being reflected in the Meyendorff translation. Wherever possible throughout this new translation, the Greek words are translated by a single English word. In essence, the unexpected conclusion from the translation of this book was that over the past 1,000 years or so, alongside the advance of science and technology, there had been a general deterioration in our deeper understanding of ourselves and the world. a deterioration in which the vast majority of people had begun to think of things not as they can be understood, but simply as they appear at a cursory glance taken without intervening thought. As I hope to show later in a separate book, not only did these factors suggest that there has been a change which has been in some way harmful to our humanity, but they gave pointers to ways in which this damage might be undone. The possibility of a cure is one of the reasons for raising this question in such a book as this. Later, I shall explain the way in which these observations link to the special way this translation approaches the ideas of nous and psyche. Translating these words in the way used here provides a number of clues to the deeper meaning of the text, and I am already convinced that this deeper meaning has the most practical significance. It is well known that Palamas's theology, particularly as expressed in the polemical side of the triads, was closely involved with the struggle against the rationalist thought that had already begun to change the doctrine of the Western churches during his lifetime. This rationalism of his time was associated with a reawakening of certain elements of pre-Christian philosophical thought known by Palamas as sometimes known today by the name Hellenistic thinking, an approach that was closely allied to the stream of thought which has since then led to massive changes in the thinking of the Western churches. It also seems that it was this rationalist divergence from Christ's original teaching which in our time has led to the decline of the Christian religion in the West. During this change, a teaching about God, who is repeatedly described as inaccessible to the senses and inexplicable to reason, becomes inexplicably rationalized and made sensible. It was Palamas in his writings who probably best defined the flaws in this belief by defining a different way in which God can be known. His approach to this question is neither based on sensory observation nor intellectual analysis, although it does require an intellectual understanding that there can exist another way of knowing, different from that of the modern scientific and rationalist thought. But his answer has until now been little understood in the West. So far is this concept from modern thought that it is only those who have sufficient experience of the effective spiritual practices of that time who will see the truth of Palamas's argument. From that, they may then come to understand that reason won the day in those troubled times, at least from the point of view of the hesychastic communities of Orthodox Christianity. As a direct result of this, the spirituality of the West today is often no more than a diluted form of what once existed in the Eastern Church. This failure of knowledge was not only a failure to clarify belief, it was also a failure of European thought, from Palamas's time until now, to explain certain elements of human inner experience. Certainly its outcome has now shaped life in the West for more than 700 years. The upshot of all this is that Palamas and his triads tell us a great deal about the history of the Church around 700 years ago, when its early success finally came to an end. In a very real sense, Palamas's text is, or what was actually a part of that history. It played a part in the events surrounding the change of that time. It contains much information about that period, so that to understand its historical significance, it gives it greater value. More, the book is the summation, the last line of defense, and at the same time the encapsulation of the first millennium Christian culture, the culture which was the ark, the origin from which more than any other single society our modern civilization sprang. This very text, translated on the following pages, uniquely defines the boundaries in time of that culture. For the author tells us how and almost exactly when it began, and how and exactly when, to within 5 years or so, and acceptable accuracy over 700 years, it began to end. More recent researches into the questions it has raised have also helped us to understand its significance, the different concept of religion that existed in that time, the reality of its outcome, the intelligence of its proponents. One set of clues was found by taking account of the understanding that just as language shapes thought, so the outer and inner forces which shape our life also shape our language. In this way, the language of hesychast monks like St. Gregory Palamas was shaped by lives driven by the search for God and the striving for repentance. Their language distinguished theological ideas, philosophical criteria, and psychological states, each of these taken to a fine point which, when we first hear of them, seem to show them as little different from one another and thus of little importance. If we study these ideas for the time they deserve, their meaning can begin to grow on us, their importance become apparent. In the first of the 3 volumes of Palamas's Triads, for long famous in the Eastern Church, this happens not just in one subject, that is now, in our era of specialization, regarded as a separate discipline, but in many different fields. In many of those fields, this book is important. 1. It is important to the churches because it gives a way of answering questions about the causes of the loss of faith in our times. 2. It is psychologically important in many ways, therapeutic as well as theoretical, particularly because it points to ways once known as integration, or, as Jung would call it, individuation of the human psyche. 3. It is philosophically important because it provides a number of answers that have been lost for many centuries, including new or long-lost answers to some of the classical questions of philosophy. And 4. And as we will slowly come to realize for us today, it is historically and socially important for all of these reasons. The fact that language shapes thought underlies the method which, in this translation, systematically translates key words in a way that will reveal our understanding of how Palamas and the hesychasts of his time once thought. This is important because, in the Western translations of this work that have been available until now, not only nous, but certain other Greek words have been given multiple meanings varying according to the context. There were obviously good reasons for some of these variations. For example, they would fit more easily into modern thought. Yet in fact, some of them seem to produce certain confusions in the reader. As we worked on this text, it began to appear that the confusions themselves, once understood, were showing us one of the most important conclusions to be drawn from the text. They revealed how different are the conclusions drawn by our contemporary thought from that of the first Christian millennium, giving glimpses of a fundamental divergence between 2 very different ways of seeing the world. Contrasting these 2 worldviews showed that they influenced perception itself, presenting the world to the psyche in 2 ways that appeared remarkably different one from the other. Under the influence of the normal contemporary Western worldview, the way things appear to the senses is taken as the nature of those things in themselves. This means that any difference in how they appear to us appears tautologically as a difference in their nature. That is to say that different appearances of one thing are mistakenly seen as if they were different things, subject to different laws, in different contradiction to the millennia-old philosophical understanding that apparent differences are not real. They are only apparent differences caused when the same thing is seen in different ways. Philosophical insights of this kind, which helped to shape our civilization in the past, have little influence over people today. They count for little in a celebrity culture. From the psychological viewpoint, another remarkable example of the effects of the shift in meaning of a word from its single sense as referring to a single object to explaining its varied sensory appearances by using different words for different appearances. One example is a most important word from classical Greek, the linguistic root of our understanding of psychology, psyche. Among the varied translations of this word psyche are some that are among the most important concepts in contemporary thought. One problem is that the translations of psyche overlap with those of other words, many of them found in the triads, nous, for instance, and dianoia. In the French translation of Palamas's triads, both psyche and nous are at different times translated by esprit, E-S-P-R-I-T. In a previous English translation, the same principle has been applied, so that both are given as mind. As well as mind, there are several other English words that are also used to render the Greek psyche. Life is one, and soul, one of the most imprecise terms in the English language, is another. As I shall show later in our present age, there is a divergence between what is understood by one of these different meanings and what is understood by another. We do not always think of them as the same thing. For example, soul, sometimes thought to be something within us that departs at death, and is said in our theology to be the subject of salvation. Psyche, the subject of our psychology. Life, the life processes that begin at birth and end at death. And mind, the mental factor that is the concern of philosophical questions such as the famous mind-brain problem. The divergence between these different meanings of a single word lies like a warning flag exactly on the primary or most important fault line that divides our fragmented Western civilization, at just the place where in-depth investigation would be recommended if someone wished to understand and perhaps heal that fragmentation. This is not accidental. Each of these different appearances that represent the psyche underlie significant misunderstandings about human nature, misunderstandings which have helped to shape modern life. All relate to a question that was recurrent in philosophy even before the original Greek awakening. Christian doctrine, and in the same way ancient teachings such as the Vedas, are all subject to a particular type of decay. Over the centuries, as they have become diffused, they then become fragmented, and their doctrines become increasingly dualistic, materialistic, and anthropocentric. The inescapable conclusion of all this is that to understand this word psyche in particular, we have to think about all of this very carefully. So first, we will further develop three of the most important meanings of the word. Number one, psyche. Psyche consists primarily of thoughts, feelings, memories, impulses, and so on, which arise within us and pass through the field of our attention. We experience these things inside ourselves and never outside. Some modern thinkers, like David Bohm, call all of this thought. Mind is sometimes taken as synonymous with psyche, sometimes in Cartesian terms as one side of the mind-body problem of contemporary philosophy. 2. Soul. Soul is spoken about in theory, in translations of doctrine, and in myth, but I have never met anyone who was entirely sure in what way it was experienced, except as we experience the psyche. 3. Life. Life exists tautologically in every living creature, or in a slightly different way in plants. Crystals grow too, but we may find it difficult to be sure that they are alive. The first and most obvious sign by which we recognize life is in movement, including speech. But people also seem to recognize it in the smaller movements that exist out of sight within living creatures. In digestion, the circulation of the blood and the movement of other fluids, in the tensing of muscles, and whatever nervous activity is perceptible to us. There are two different lessons in these observations. The first is that seen in different ways, one thing can look like things that are entirely different. What it seems to be, how it appears, depends entirely on the way we perceive it. The interesting thing is that under different circumstances, one or another of those three appearances seems to be obvious or intuitive. The second lesson relates specifically to the understanding of the psyche. Each different word for it, in representing a different appearance, represents a different way in which the concept of psyche can be understood, and in our times at least, these different viewpoints on the one thing known as the psyche lead to conflicting ways of understanding and thinking about it, ways that cannot all be true. A little thought will show that some of these conflicting viewpoints can only be totally misleading. One result is that different disciplines think about the same object in different ways. Modern theology thinks about soul, often meaning psyche in a particular way. Modern psychology thinks about psyche as mind or as certain processes of mind. Biology thinks of life and translates the Greek concepts of psyche as life, more in a way linked to chemistry. Considered on the basis of how it is seen by the senses, each of the three thus seems to be entirely different from the other two. But if we can manage to remember and keep in mind that all these three appearances are in essence just one thing, then we will find that we can begin to understand it in a different and more complete way. In fact, each different meaning of the word represents a different appearance, but each is a different appearance of the same reality. Underlying this difference in meaning is the fact that it can be seen as providing evidence of different states of mind. The division in the appearance of the psyche is in part the product of a division between alternative ways in which we become aware of the psyche. In particular, there is one major divergence revealed in how we conceive of the psyche. We see it as different and differing fragments, or we see it as a unity. And this difference occurs in part because both situations occur in the psyche at different times, depending on the state of that part of the psyche which the Greeks called the nous. The action of the human nous is found in attention. The Greek word for attention is also nous. The one word describes the thing and its activity. Attention is also linked to awareness and recognition, and the unity of the nous underlies both inner and outer perception. But because the outer is obvious, the inner is often ignored. Thus, the division of meanings is rooted in a division in our perceptions. Such apparent divisions do not exist in the substance of what is perceived, but arise only in that which perceives. Differences in perception stem from different ways of perceiving something, not from essential differences in what is perceived. A nous, when its attention is lost in the activities of the nous, is fragmented, its awareness divided, and this is the root of division itself. All these three, life, soul, and psyche, then, are apparent divisions in this sense, but their different appearances are based on real differences in the way we perceive the one thing which is the psyche. In the case of nous, the confusion created by the existence of multiple appearances of a single thing has once again led to difficulties in translating this Greek word. Nous is now often translated not as the knowing core of reason, but as a word now understood to refer only to the everyday thoughts, a term which describes its coinage but not its value, its form but not its full meaning. In some way, this difference in appearance represents a breakdown, a narrowing in our ability to understand, not only a limitation in our ability to understand Palamas's book, but also in our ability to understand experience. Further inquiry suggests that this was evidence of a conceptual fragmentation symptomatic of a widespread general deterioration in the use of the human mind, and even to suggest certain reasons for this deterioration. It appears more than possible that modern problems, such as ADD, attention deficit disorder, might directly result from this. In the Greek of Palamas's time, attention is an action of the nous. In fact, nous, as described by Palamas and the fathers who had gone before him, is not just psyche, but the highest part of the psyche, the eye of the psyche, the long-lost, ruling, inmost heart of the human psyche. It is through the actions of the nous, and of grace acting through that nous, that, as St. Maximus says, quote, man remains holy man in psyche and body, and through grace becomes holy God in psyche and body. With nous, as with psyche, the difference between the way it appears from different viewpoints leads to our concluding wrongly that these different aspects originate from different objects, since the different names representing different appearances seem to belong to what are actually different things. To think about different appearances of a single thing as if they represented different things behaving in entirely different ways, what is this, if not a serious confusion in our thinking? The Christian use of the word Hezekiah was first defined in the 4th century, and in Gregory of Nyssa's Life of Moses it was used to help define the contemplative mysticism of the time. This was one of the stages during which the teaching of the Church was developed further to correct for growing divergence from the original stream of the New Testament teaching. It was in these elaborations of the original Christian teaching that the distinction between inner and outer and ascetic and purely liturgical forms of Christianity first began to become visible. It should be noted here that the ascetic forms almost always include the liturgical aspect of the faith, although the opposite is not true. Palamas's writings, particularly the triads, relate to a further elaboration that became necessary for the same reasons, so that his theology is closely involved with the struggle against the rationalist thought, which since then has led to massive changes in the Western churches. It is those changes, that divergence from Christ's original teaching, which has led to the decline of the Christian religion in the Western churches. The importance of this relates to the idea that has been expressed simplistically in the saying that, quote, it is said that Christianity has been tried and failed. In fact, it has never failed because it has never been properly tried, end quote. Correctly understood, Palamas's writings give the lie to this saying, showing that Christianity was originally successful, but the complete teaching of the successful form never reached the West, except to a very small group of people. Yet today it still survives, hidden within the Eastern churches. The truth is that Christianity has been repeatedly tried and has repeatedly succeeded on a small scale, but that it has failed to spread from those successive small beginnings without being so distorted that it becomes almost ineffective. In part 1 of this first volume of his triads, Palamas begins by defining the fine distinctions between the two kinds of wisdom described by St. Paul, the wisdom of the world and the wisdom of God. When we first begin to study this, it seems needlessly complex, but once it is fully understood, it comes to life and then seems entirely meaningful. As we study it, we find that we have also drawn in the outline of an answer to one as yet unanswered contemporary question: the proper relation of science and religion as two different forms of knowledge obtained in different ways and serving two quite different purposes. The link with the nous lies in the fact that one of these forms of wisdom is intellectual and rational. One seems to glimpse ways in which past mistranslations of nous have been responsible for the overemphasis on this intellectual aspect. Quote from Dionysius: "Therefore the light of Christ in us is the foundation of hesychast spirituality, the contrast between knowledge coming from outside, a human and purely symbolic knowledge, and noetic knowledge coming from within is found already in Pseudo-Dionysius. It is not from without that God moves them towards the divine, but in a noetic way, by illuminating them from within with the most divine will by means of a pure and immaterial light." End quote. The confusion of intellectual and sensory sources of knowledge with noetic knowledge coming from within explains the varied beliefs normal in and between the modern churches. Noetic knowledge is not imagination, but true intuition, in the sense that it is the only form of intuition which tells true, knowledge whose source is subjective, but whose accuracy is best defined by the term objective. We can think of it paradoxically as, quote, inner objectivity. This discussion between the two kinds of knowledge and the two kinds of thinking that belong to them is largely found in Part 1 of the present translation. Its implications are developed in Part 2 when Palamas moves on to the question of what today is known as personal development. Both first and third parts hinge on the fact that in Palamas's time, as in our own, people were forced to believe that human reason, aided only by the senses and logic, was unable to know God directly. This disbelief in ability of human reason to know God leads, says Meyendorff, to two alternatives. The evidence is either hearsay or experiential. Number one, hearsay evidence leads to dependence on Scripture. This can seem to be mere hearsay unless we have the second. 2. The experiential or experimental evidence is defined in the classic hesychast formula in which we know God, not directly and immediately, but as a result of certain of his actions which we can observe. The earliest full expression of this formula was probably in the triads. Quote, "The supernatural union with the more than unresplendent light is the sole source of sure theology." End quote. Of course, this is a final reduction of the problem, which often appears as no more than a massive oversimplification. There is the suggestion that God can be known platonically as an archetype, an idea that is in the origin of all ideas. Then there is the idea of knowing God in our own actions. Evangelist Billy Graham once admitted on television that he was not entirely sure how much he should do to help bring others to God and what he should leave to the Lord. In Part 2 of his first triad, Palamas goes into the fine points of what should be left to God, not in the transformation of others, but in our own spiritualization. In doing so, he provides a method remarkably like yoga, but still entirely Christian in its ultimate dependence on grace. And if we investigate it fully, we discover that the early fathers of the Church tended to fall into two camps: those who drew from ancient teachings and emphasized the importance of individual effort, and those who drew mostly on the gospel and emphasized the undoubted preeminence of faith and grace. Throughout the long history of the patristic era, when the Church was shaped by the most spiritual of its fathers, one of these fathers would fill the role of reconciler, skillfully organizing this knowledge so that the proper and living relationship between the two aspects became visible again. Not only was Palamas, as described by Meyendorff, such a man, but his thoughts but his thought was particularly important as summing up the thinking of his kind in his era. Palamas, says Meyendorff, provided such a doctrine and a strict hierarchy of values. He did so by integrating the spiritual vocabulary derived from Evagrius and more recent psychophysical methods of prayer with a harmonious conception of life in Jesus Christ. In this way, he continued the work of the Fathers who, without avoiding those elements whose non-Christian origins could not be in doubt, adapted them as reflections of natural mysticism to the unique reality of the Christian mystery. It goes without saying that this adaptation inwardly modified the meaning of the terms employed and put them in harmony with the biblical teaching on man." End quote. Throughout all this, we find a common thread based on a psychological understanding almost entirely unknown in the West for near 1,000 years. This thread is found simply by employing a consistent rendering of the classical Greek words nous and psyche. This is based on the judgment that at that time and in that psychological context, each of these words was used as a technical term having a single clear and precise meaning, that meaning defined by repeated experience. It is this full experiential meaning which has long been forgotten, so that today these important words are translated in different ways at different times, even within the context of the writings of Palamas, who is known to have been concerned to resolve differences in language used by different fathers, so that he will have used language with a professional precision. In other sources, nous is given as the French esprit, normally translated in English as mind, as Augustine's Latin intellectus, which normally today comes into English as intellect, despite the fact that the modern use of this word intellect is not remotely like the Platonic or Byzantine use of nous. It also appears in the Latin as ratio, reason. The Cambridge Platonists spotted this latter, and in so doing uncovered in the Christian thought of the past just that significance of the nous which we find in Palamas and other earlier fathers, a significance which gives the teaching of the fathers a holistic, unitive meaning, nothing like the modern discursive intellect. It was then understood as the seat of inspiration and insight, the core of the attention, the spotlight of clarity. When magnetized by love of God, it became the mysterious magnetic center of Russian hesychasm, a synonym for the Ark of Bulrushes, and later the Ark of the Covenant of Gregory of Nyssa's mythical Moses of the mind. It is found in mystical experience as the stillness beyond everyday life, the forgotten place of God of the ancient mystics, with its sapphire pavement. A silent psyche is a clear and open mind, but most of the time this part of the mind is not so silent. Hesychasm was a way of learning to be inwardly silent.